Hi there, welcome to this video where we continue taking a look at Bertrand Russell's Principles of Mathematics. In the last video I got up to the end of section of chapter 4, section 55 I got up to in that video, so naturally in this video we're going to be starting off with section 56, which is the first section of chapter 5, which is titled Denoting. So this video is going to work in a similar way to the previous videos. I'm going to read through the chapter. There are some paragraphs that I'm actually going to miss out of this because they're particularly in section 61, where Russell gives a couple of dozen examples of some expressions using certain denoting concepts that really there's no point in me actually saying them out loud. I'll refer to them as I need to, but I'm not necessarily going to go through all of them. But I'm going to read through the chapter almost in its entirety, and every now and again I'm going to stop off, give some explanation, some interpretation to the best of my ability of what I think is going on. This is, as with the last couple of videos, this is going to be an unscripted video, so you will have to bear with me from time to time if I need to think a little bit about what I want to say. Please don't watch this video expecting that you will come away with definitive answers to everything. So Russell is, I think he's been as clear as he can be in writing this. He's got some brilliant ideas, but the nature of philosophical thought and so on is some of the ideas are just so abstract, and sometimes the distinctions that need to be made are so fine that language sometimes is just not, it's not fine enough, it's not articulate enough to really make those distinctions. Okay, so we're going to try our best. I'm going to try my best to communicate my ideas. If you do have any questions, of course, then please feel free to ask any questions. This is not intended to be a nice summary video. The reason that I'm going through, that I'm reading through the chapter is because it's Principles of Mathematics is just such a difficult book to try to summarize. So I did do this a few years ago. I did try to do this a few years ago with a video that I made with Principles of Mathematics, where I tried to summarize the chapters, and I just wasn't happy. Hence, I never made a follow-up to that video because I just wasn't happy really with how it turned out. There was just so much information that I had to miss out. The only way that I can really capture all of the information that I think is necessary is to literally just read through and try to explain as I go through. So this is definitely not some kind of nice summary of Principles of Mathematics. If you do want to read Principles of Mathematics, then I would suggest that you take the time to study it if you really want to try to understand it. Suffice it to say that it's a number of years since I first started trying to read Principles of Mathematics, and there's still a ton of it that I can't honestly say that I understand. It's something that I come back to every now and again, and I'll spend maybe a couple of months on it, and then I'll leave it alone for a while. It's not the kind of book that you would be able to read in an afternoon or something like that. If you've never read it before, then it's going to be something that you're really going to have to take the time trying to understand what's going on. Okay, so let's make a start then. So as usual, I'm going to be reading from my copy here. I'm going to put up on the screen roughly the sections that I'm talking about, but sometimes I do forget to change the screen. So it would be really useful if you've got your own copy of Principles of Mathematics, whether it's a hard copy, digital copy, or whatever, so that you can keep up. So if I do forget to change the screen, then you still know what you can still follow it. Okay. So anyway, section 56 some of these sections, there's quite a lot for me to say. There is a little bit of ambiguity that I've, from time to time, that I've not really satisfied myself about exactly what Russell means. I'll point those out as long as I remember. Then I'll point those issues out as we go through. I don't know how far we're going to get through this chapter. I doubt we're going to get to the end of it. So I expect that I'm probably going to have to make a couple of videos at least on this chapter. So let's get going anyway. So section 56. The notion of denoting, like most of the notions of logic, has been obscured hitherto by an undue admixture of psychology. There is a sense in which we denote, when we point or describe or employ words as symbols for concepts. This, however, is not the sense that I wish to discuss, but the fact that description is possible, that we are able, by the employment of concepts, to designate a thing which is not a concept, is due to a logical relation between some concepts and some terms, in virtue of which such concepts inherently and logically denote such terms. So I touched on this briefly in the last video. And what I was the example that I gave there was if we say that I've just got a new pet dog and I've decided to call it Rover. Okay, very original. So I can say Rover is a dog. Right, so this is repeated from the last video, but I'm going to repeat it here because it's kind of relevant. So we've got Rover. Let me just rotate my board a little bit. Rover is a dog. But we can also say Rover is a 5-letter word. So in the first proposition, or the first statement, however you want to call it, the word rover here is clearly referring to the thing that is my pet dog that is called Rover. Hence, Rover is a dog is a perfectly sensible thing to say. Okay? But in the second case, Rover is a 5-letter word. I'm no longer referring to the thing that is my pet dog that is called Rover. I'm talking about the word here, right? So in the first case, the word rover is being used to designate something, to denote something other than itself. It's a concept that is being used to denote a term. The term is my pet dog, which happens to be called Rover. On the other hand, rover is a 5-letter word. I'm kind of using. I don't know how to strictly think about it, but the word is kind of denoting itself in a sense, if we want to think about it that way. So obviously context will tell us what we're talking about in a given instance in each of these cases. But sometimes it's particularly when you're dealing with abstract ideas, it might not be so clear. So here it's obvious, right? If I say rover is a 5-letter word, I'm not talking about my dog. If I say rover is a dog, I'm not talking about the 5-letter words rover. But in certain cases, when we're trying to represent very abstract ideas, some confusion is possible. So what we can do is we can put inverted commas around rover to indicate that we're wanting to talk about the word rover. Okay, so then rover is a 5-letter word. We know that we're talking about the word rover. So this is what he's kind of getting at here, that there is this peculiar relation between some concepts, between concepts and the terms which they denote. It is this sense of denoting which is here in question. This notion lies at the bottom, I think, of all theories of substance, of the subject-predicate logic, and of the opposition between things and ideas, discursive thought and immediate perception. These various developments in the main appear to me mistaken, while the fundamental fact itself, out of which they have grown, is hardly ever discussed in its logical purity. It might be worth reading as well Russell's article, quite famous article, on denoting. can't remember the year that it was published, maybe 1905 or something like that, where he goes into a bit more detail with this, and it was quite a significant article. It's had a lot of impact. The theory that he effectively really introduced, or the doctrine that he introduced in that article, has been gradually built on over the years, and obviously it's been criticised from various angles. But it's worth reading. You almost certainly be able to download a copy of that off from the internet on denoting. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to understand. There are a few passages which are a little bit tricky. The Gray's elegy passage is, for me, quite tricky. It's simple to get. It's easy to get easy-ish to get the gist of what he's talking about in the Gray's elegy passage. What I'm not convinced about is whether the notation that he uses is quite right. I've not managed to convince myself that the notation that he uses is quite right, but I understand what he's trying to. I think I understand what he's trying to say anyway. In that passage, but anyway, so a concept denotes when, if it occurs in a proposition, the proposition is not about the concept, but about a term connected in a certain peculiar way with the concept. So if I say, I met a man, the proposition is not about a man. So notice that a man in my book is italicized. So it's here. If I mark it on the screen, it's italicized. So he uses italics when he's wanting to refer to, just like I've used inverted commas here with Rover. Bertrand Russell's often uses italics to achieve the same kind of interpretation. It doesn't really make any difference whether you use italics or whether you use inverted commas or whatever, whether you write it in a different color. It doesn't make any difference as long as it's clear. It's made clear from what you write what you're referring to. So if I say I met a man, the proposition is not about a man, italicized. This is a concept which does not walk the streets, but lives in the shadowy limbo of the logic books. So I met a man. What he's saying is that if we can take this on a very literal level. And if we do that, we might be apt to believe, quite foolishly, that when I say, I met a man, that somehow I met a concept, an abstract concept somewhere. Or I met this collection of symbols, these words somewhere. That's not what's intended. Obviously, that's absurd. Nobody would seriously think like that, I would hope. What we understand here is when I say, I met a man, we understand that I met an actual person, okay? Not some abstract concept, but an actual person. So this is what he's going on to say. What I met was a thing, not a concept, an actual man with a tailor and a bank account or a public house and a drunken wife, okay? So I can make a proposition about the concept a man, but again, I'm going to have to use either italics or inverted commas just to clarify that that's what I'm talking about. So if I can write, for example, a man is a denoting concept, for instance, which it is, then what I'm talking about here is a man, the denoting concept, which is a denoting concept. I'm not talking about a man, an actual man, right? So there is this. There are these distinctions that we need to make. So he goes on to say, again, the proposition any finite number is odd or even is plainly true. Yet the concept any finite number is neither odd nor even. It is only particular numbers that are odd or even. There is not, in addition to these, another entity, any number, which is either odd or even, and if there were, it is plain that it could not be odd and could not be even. Of the concept, any number, almost all the propositions that contain the phrase any number are false. So then he goes on to say, if we wish to speak of the concept, we have to indicate the fact by italics or inverted commas. It's a fairly standard thing to do. So if we confuse, for example, a man, if we understand it as a concept or something that is denoted, if we get this wrong, then the propositions can potentially be false. Okay, so if I say a man is a denoting concept, if I don't use that is a true proposition. If I don't include the inverted commas and I just say a man is a denoting concept, then arguably, according to our conventions here now, this is false. A man is a denoting concept, because now I'm talking about an actual man, right? And well, actually, a man denotes some sort of combination of terms, which we'll be talking about extensively later in this chapter. So actually, it's not talking about, strictly speaking, here it's not denoting a particular man. It's denoting some particular combination of terms of men. Okay, it's like I say, more will be said about this later in the chapter. So forgive me for not going through it in too much detail right now. I will be saying more about it. So people often assert that man is mortal, but what is mortal will die, and yet we should be surprised to find in the times. So he's been a bit facetious here, but let's see what he's got to say. We should be surprised to find in the times such a notice as the following: died at his residence of Camelot, Gladstone Road, Upper Tooting, on the 18th of June, 19 whatever. Man, eldest son of death and sin. Man, italicized, in fact does not die. Hence, if man is mortal, whereas it appears to be a proposition about man, italicized, it would be simply false. The fact is, the proposition is about men, and here again, it is not about the concept men, italicized, but about what this concept denotes. The whole theory of definition of identity, of classes, of symbolism, and of the variable is wrapped up in the theory of denoting. The notion is a fundamental notion of logic, and in spite of its difficulties, it is quite essential to be as clear as about it as possible. Okay, so on to section 57. The notion of denoting may be obtained by a kind of logical genesis from subject-predicate propositions, upon which it seems more or less dependent. The simplest of propositions are those in which one predicate occurs otherwise than as a term, and there is only one term of which the predicate in question is asserted. Such propositions may be called subject-predicate propositions. Instances are A is one, A is human. Concepts which are predicates might also be called class concepts because they give rise to classes, but we shall find it necessary to distinguish between the words predicate and class concept. Okay, so we've got predicates, and we've got this very closely aligned notion of class concept, or class concepts. So an example of a predicate, which I gave in previous videos, is human. So this is an adjective. And then on the other hand, we've got if not, well, possibly one of the corresponding class concepts to human, which is man. Okay. And we're using Russell's examples here. So there's clearly a grammatical difference between human and man. But sorry, have I got this right? Predicates and also called. You're right. Okay. So there is clearly a grammatical distinction between these two, human and man. But if we think back to chapter 4, right at the beginning of chapter 4, a grammatical difference may or may not indicate a genuine philosophical difference. So if I just read part of section 46 again, although a grammatical distinction cannot be uncritically assumed to correspond to a genuine philosophical difference, yet the one is prima facie evidence of the other, and may often be most usefully employed as a source of discovery. Okay, so because we've got a clear grammatical difference here between human and man, what Russell says is effectively, yes, we need to distinguish between these two notions based on this grammatical difference. But the alignment of these two notions is so close that to a certain extent we might consider them one and the same thing. There might not actually be a genuine philosophical difference between the two, even though there is a grammatical difference. If there is a genuine philosophical difference, it appears to be so slight that we can't really tell if there is a genuine philosophical difference. And for all intents and purposes, we can, in a lot of cases, just kind of use the predicate and class concepts almost interchangeably. Okay, if we want to work on a really, really strict level, yes, we need to make the distinction, but otherwise we can be a bit blasé about it. Okay. So propositions of the subject-predicate type always imply and are implied by other propositions of the type which asserts that an individual belongs to a class. Thus, the above instances are equivalent to A is an entity, A is a unit, A is a man. Okay, so we've got A is human. This is the subject-predicate form, so the subject is A. The predicate is human. That's the subject. And then we've got the verb is, which is not acting as a relation here necessarily. The assertion, remember Russell doesn't, he analyzes a subject-predicate proposition into subject and assertion because he gets the hump about missing out the verb, right? He's not happy with that. If we analyze a subject-predicate proposition into subject and predicate, we lose the verb, which he thinks is an essential part of the proposition. So he analyzes subject-predicate propositions into subject and assertion. The assertion in this case being is human. But what he says is that any proposition of this kind, subject-predicate kind, implies and is implied by a proposition of the form A is a man. Or in this case, A is human, implies and is implied by A is a man. So here we've got the subject. Now it's a little bit confusing here. Man, it's difficult to know how. There's a note on corresponding to the next section. I think section 58, which. It's right at the bottom of the page here on the screen now. It's the note starts. So it's talking about two allied propositions. Propositions expressed by the same words. So on the one hand, if we take this A as a man, we can understand this in two different ways really. A is a man, and A is a man. And these are two genuinely distinct propositions. So it's difficult to say at this stage, but it's not clear to me exactly which way we're expected to interpret this A as a man here in this particular instance. Is it this way or is it this way? Because the class concept here is man. Right, so we've got the subject and we've got the class concept, which is man. But then if we group these words together, a man, this is not a class concept, it's a concept derived from the class concept, but this is a denoting concept. Man is not a denoting concept, but a man is a denoting concept. And throughout this section 57, he does seem to kind of flip in between these two interpretations. A is a man, and A is a man. Okay, I'll say more about these when we get onto maybe section 58. So it is a little bit unclear exactly what he's referring to with this. So I'll try my best with this. Where did I get up to? But the point is that A is human, this subject-predicate proposition, implies and is implied by a proposition of a different grammatical form. It may be the same proposition, but we can't guarantee it, which has this class concept man as a component. So these propositions are at least equivalent. And what he's saying is that any subject-predicate proposition can always be thought of as a proposition, or it can always be replaced with an equivalent proposition of the form where we've got a subject and a class concept involved. Okay. Right. So yeah, so propositions of the subject predicate type, so these new propositions are not identical with the previous ones since they have an entirely different form, a different grammatical form. To begin with, is now the only concept not used as a term. A man, we shall find, is neither a concept nor a term, but a certain kind of combination of certain terms, namely of those which are human. So what he seems to be... how he seems to be considering this A as a man here is A is a man. Okay, so he seems to be grouping the a man together. And in that case, we've got two... A man is not really... It's not a term, but as he says here, it's a certain kind of combination of certain terms. But the is here is being used now as a relation. It's relating A to a man. Okay? Whereas in A is human, A is not it's not really behaving like a relation. Okay, so there certainly is a different grammatical structure between these two propositions. And the relation of Socrates to a man is quite different from his relation to humanity. Indeed, Socrates is human must be held, if the above view is correct, to be not, in the most usual sense, a judgment of relation between Socrates and humanity, since this view would make human occur as term in Socrates is human. It is, of course, undeniable that a relation to humanity is implied by Socrates is human. Namely, the relation expressed by Socrates has humanity. And this relation conversely implies the subject-predicate proposition, but the two propositions can be clearly distinguished, and it is important to the theory of classes that this should be done. Thus we have, in the case of every predicate, so that's important, every predicate, so it's quite a bold claim here. I'm not personally entirely convinced by this, that this applies to every predicate, but we'll take Russell's word for it. Thus we have, in the case of every predicate, three types of propositions which imply one another, namely, Socrates is human, Socrates has humanity, and Socrates is a man. Okay. The first contains a term and a predicate. The second, two terms and a relation. So we looked at this in the previous chapter. Socrates has humanity, or humanity belongs to Socrates, for example. The second term being identical with the predicate of the first proposition. So remember also from the previous chapter we had human and humanity. There's a grammatical difference between the two, but what he says in there somewhere is that, where is it? In section 46, by the looks of things, human and humanity denote precisely the same concept. Okay, the difference being is that when we say Socrates is human, we're using human, that concept, as a predicate, not as a term. Socrates has humanity, we're using humanity as another term in that proposition. So then has is behaving as a relation. We've got two terms, Socrates and humanity, and we've got a relation between the two. So there is a grammatical difference between the two, and they do generate propositions of a different grammatical form, and possibly different propositions, but equivalent propositions, okay? While the third contains a term, a relation, and what I shall call a disjunction, a term which will be explained shortly. So he's talking about here a man. So I'm going to go on to the next page. So he's talking, if we've got Socrates is a man, he's grouping the man together, and the is here is behaving like a relation. We've got the term Socrates, and then we've got this thing here, a man, which is not a term, it's a combination of terms. So we do have a relation between a term and some very specific particular combination of terms, which is denoted by this denoting concept, a man. Okay, so all of these propositions, Socrates is human, Socrates has humanity, and Socrates is a man, are all they're all of different forms, but they're all equivalent. They imply and are implied by each other. So the class concept differs little, if at all, from the predicate. So that's what I was saying earlier, right? We've got this very close alignment between predicates and class concepts, which even Russell is saying here, the class concept differs little, if at all, from the predicate. So it seems a little bit uncertain. There seems to be a difference, which might be suggested by the grammatical difference, but whether there is an actual difference there, we don't really know. It seems to be very slight. Anyway, while the class, as opposed to the class concept, is the sum or conjunction of all the terms which have the given predicate. Okay, so classes will be something that we'll be talking about a lot more in the next chapter. The sun's going to be shining right in my eyes. Just bear with me a second. Okay. So we'll be talking a lot more about classes in the next chapter, in chapter 6. So I'm not going to dwell on that too much now. But a class is considered as a certain, again, a very specific combination of terms. And we use a denoting concept, not this one, not a man, but a different denoting concept, which we will be talking about soon, to kind of denote the class. Classes are very... so it mustn't be thought that the classes of principles of mathematics are to be equated with, say, sets of modern set theory. They're a totally different thing. Now, it might be that the concept of set has kind of grown out of the notion of class, in a certain way. But the way that we need to understand classes in the way that they're introduced and taught and spoken about in Principles of Mathematics, it's a very different concept. Okay, we'll there's a lot to say on it in the next chapter. The relation which occurs in the second type, Socrates has humanity, is characterized completely by the fact that it implies and is implied by a proposition with only one term, in which the other term of the relation has become a predicate. So he's talking about the Socrates is human. So in general, if we've got a proposition that's comparable in form to Socrates has humanity, this always implies and is implied by another proposition of the subject predicate form. Okay, so comparable to Socrates is human. A class is a certain combination of terms. A class concept is closely akin to a predicate. So again, he says it's closely akin to a predicate. He doesn't say it's the same as. So he is still making a distinction between the two. And the terms whose combination forms the class are determined by the class concept. Predicates are, in a certain sense, the simplest type of concepts, since they occur in the simplest type of proposition, the subject's predicate type. Section 58. There is connected with every predicate a great variety of closely allied concepts, which, insofar as they are distinct, it is important to distinguish. Starting, for example, with human. So I'm going to write these down, actually. So we start with human. And let me get rid of that, actually, because it's going to be a bit confusing. Human. So we've got a whole range of allied concepts. So we've got man. What does he say? Men. All men. Which actually these are basically the same, men and all men. Every man, any man, and the human race, which is very similar to this in what it denotes. It doesn't denote exactly the same thing, but it denotes a very similar thing. Namely, men and all men. These denotes a class as many. The human race denotes a class as one. We've also got, so he goes on to say, starting, for example, with human, we have man, men, all men, every man, any man, the human race, of which all except the first are twofold, a denoting concept and an object denoted, right? So man, so this is a class concept, a class concept corresponding to human. It does not denote, but it's from this we can derive the various denoting concepts: men, all men, every man, any man, the human race, and we also have a man and some man, as he says. We have also less closely analogous the notions of a man and some man. So all of these denoting concepts are going to be discussed at length throughout this chapter. It could take a while to get through because there are some very fine distinctions to be made between these. It might not be in this video that we get through that, but certainly in the next couple of videos also. There is also another one that he doesn't mention here, which is the man. He does kind of keep this separate. I'm going to write it here, but he's not included it here. But there is the man, which he keeps separate because it does seem to have very particular features to it, which he analyzes separately. So the other ones, all men, every man, any man, a man, some man, he kind of groups together, and then there's the man, which he keeps a little bit separate. Okay, so less closely analogous the notions of a man and some man, which again denotes objects other than themselves. This vast apparatus connected with every predicate must be borne in mind, and an endeavour must be made to give an analysis of all the above notions. But for the present, it is the property of denoting rather than the various denoting concepts that we are concerned with. The combination of concepts as such to form new concepts of greater complexity than their constituents is a subject upon which writers on logic have said many things. But the combination of terms as such to form what by analogy may be called complex terms is a subject upon which logicians, old and new, give us only the scantiest discussion. Nevertheless, the subject is of vital importance to the philosophy of mathematics, since the nature both of number and of the variable turns upon just this point. 6 words of constant occurrence in daily life are also characteristic of mathematics. These are the words all, every, any, are, some, and the. For correctness of reasoning, it is essential that these words should be sharply distinguished one from another. But the subject bristles with difficulties, it really does, and is almost wholly neglected by logicians. Okay, so this is where we start with an analysis, a serious analysis of these words. This gets very, very tricky at parts. All I can say is that going forward, there will be some things that I will try to explain to the best of my ability, but I can't make any guarantees that I will necessarily make myself perfectly clear. Some of the distinctions that are going to be made of the next few sections are very, very slight. And it's taken me personally a while to convince myself that there is actually a distinction there. It is important, I think, to really make the effort, though. If Russell does say that there is a distinction between this and that, and at first glance we think, well, no, there isn't a distinction there. I think it is important to try, in order to try to get to a good understanding of what Russell's talking about in this book. It's important to try to see things from Russell's perspective, even if you don't necessarily agree with it. So there might be some words that he uses, for example, the denoting concepts corresponding to a and some. You know, it might be that you think, well, there isn't a distinction there, or between every and any, you might say there's no distinction there. I would probably tend to agree that sometimes the distinction is very difficult to make, and it's very, very slight. But it is, I think that it is possible to make a distinction. Whether that distinction is ultimately worth making, well, according to Russell it is. Whether you think it is, or anybody else or whatever, that's a separate point. But again, what we're trying to do here is or what I'm trying to do with these videos is try to get to as close an understanding of Russell's meaning as possible. So that does mean that sometimes I've got to ignore my personal prejudices and try my very best to accept what Russell is saying and come round to his way of thinking, and really make an effort to make a distinction, even when personally I might think there is no difference. Okay, we'll see this as we go through. It's plain to begin with that a phrase containing... I'll go on to the next page. It's plain to begin with that a phrase containing one of the above 6 words always denotes. It will be convenient, so the 6 words that he's talking about, all, every, any, are, some, and the. It will be convenient for the present discussion to distinguish a class concept from a predicate. So again, we're going to distinguish class concept and predicate, even though maybe they don't need to be distinguished. Because what he says next is, I shall call human a predicate and man a class concept, though the distinction is perhaps only verbal. In other words, it may just be a grammatical distinction, may not be a genuine philosophical difference between the two. The characteristic of a class concept as distinguished from terms in general is that X is a U is a propositional function when and only when U is a class concept. Okay, so X is a you. Right, so you is what does he say? The characteristic of a class concept is X is, so this is a propositional function. Whenever you, this is a class concept. Right, so a class concept is effectively derived from or aligned with a predicate. So whenever we've got u is a class concept, X is a u will be a propositional function. So he's mentioned propositional functions in some of the previous chapters. He hasn't done a full analysis of propositional functions, which is in chapter 7, which I don't fully understand, his analysis of propositional functions. But he says that X is a u will be a propositional function only in the case when u is a class concept. And it must be held that when u is not a class concept, we do not have a false proposition, but simply no proposition at all, whatever value we may give to X. So if we try to replace u, the class concept, with its closely aligned predicate, we don't have a propositional function. So again, we've got human, which is a predicate, and man, a class concept. Okay, so we've got X is a man. So because man is a class concept, then X is a man will be a propositional function. Okay. And also, but if I just try, if we completely identify predicate and class concept, even on the grammatical level, what I end up with is X is a human. This is not a propositional function. It doesn't make any sense because human is an adjective. This is like saying X is a yellow or something like that. Right? It doesn't make any sense, right? I can say X is human, and that would be a subject-predicate proposition. X is human, or propositional function, should I say? But it's what we're talking about here is something of this form: X is a man. Okay, and if we look at the note, which was started on the previous page, where was it? No, it wasn't. So this note here, which continues on to the next page, it tells us how to interpret this X is a man. So he says there are two allied propositions expressed by the same words, namely Socrates is a man and Socrates is a man. The above remarks apply to the former. So he's talking about a comment that was made in section 57. But in future, unless the contrary is indicated by a hyphen or otherwise, the latter will always be in question. Right? So presumably what he means when he says X is a you, he's talking about X is a you. The former expresses the identity of Socrates with an ambiguous individual. The latter expresses a relation of Socrates to the class concept. Aha. Okay. So, right. I'll just dwell on that a little bit now. So this is what I couldn't think how to explain this earlier in the video. I hesitated. I'll explain it now. So we've got let's go for the particular case, Socrates. Right. So we've got Socrates is let me get it the right way around, a man, and on the other hand, Socrates is a man. So what he's saying is that the former, this proposition, expresses the identity of Socrates with an ambiguous individual. That's what this is here. A man. It's an ambiguous. What is denoted here is it's some combination of terms, men, right? But not a particular term. It's an ambiguous term, right? So we're saying that Socrates is identified with one of that ambiguous collection of terms. But on the other hand, Socrates is a man, This expresses a relation of Socrates to the class concept man, right? So this is a relation here. So this is not subject-predicate form. Is being used as a relation. And we've effectively got two terms, Socrates and man. Socrates is a thing, man is a concept. And we've got a relation between the two. So there is a genuine distinction to be made between these two propositions, although they are, for all intents and purposes, equivalent. Right? Right, so where am I up to? It must be held that when U is not a class concept, we do not have a false proposition, but simply no proposition at all, whatever value we may give to X. This enables us to distinguish a class concept belonging to the null class, for which all propositions of the above form are false, from a term which is not a class concept at all. This will be important for the next chapter. I'm not going to say too much about it here. That's for the next chapter. For which there are no propositions of the above form. Also, it makes it plain that a class concept is not a term in the proposition X is a U. For U has a restricted variability if the formula is to remain a proposition. A denoting phrase, we may now say, consists always of a class concept preceded by one of the above 6 words or some synonym of one of them. So going back to our list then, man was our class concept. So we can precede man with all, every, any, some, or the. Okay. Men and all men, he does use these later on. I don't know if it's in this chapter or in the next chapter that he uses men and all men synonymously. I think it's chapter 6 where he uses that. So I won't dwell on that now. The human race, he doesn't really say much about this. He does make a brief comment about it at some point, just to say that he uses the human race as a way of denoting a class, the class of men as one. So all men, or men, will denote the class, would denote a particular class as many. Okay, these denoting concepts denote a particular combination of several terms. Well, usually several terms. There might be there is the particular case where we've just got one term involved. So when we've got a class that contains only one, that only has one term as a member, he does deal with that again in the next, but the next chapter. But for the time being, if we just take a class as generally involving more than one term, then men and all men will denote the class as many, whereas the human race effectively denotes the class as a single term. But it's not really the human race that the denoting concepts of the human race that we're interested in here. In fact, that might be more to do with this here, because of the inclusion of the definite article. Okay, so what did I get up to? Right, so we're on to 59. Do I want to go through 59? Because right. Okay, so let's go for it. Let's go for 59. So the question which first meets us in regard to denoting is this: is there one way of denoting 6 different kinds of objects, or are the ways of denoting different? And in the latter case, is the object denoted the same in all 6 cases, or does the object differ as well as the way of denoting it? In order to answer this question, it will be first necessary to explain the differences between the 6 words in question. This is fun. Here it will be convenient to omit the word the to begin with, since this word is in a different position from the others and is liable to limitations from which they are exempt. Okay, so what he's asking here is, well, literally what he says is there one way of denoting, and that same way gives rise to different objects that are denoted, or is it always the same object which is denoted, but there's just different ways of denoting it? Or is it both? is it actually there's different ways of denoting, and in each case it's a different object that's denoted that corresponds to each way of denoting? That's what we've got to try to settle. And it takes a while to get there. So I could tell you the answer now, but that would spoil the fun. Well, in fact, I could tell you what Russell eventually says, whether it's the answer, whether it's the definitive answer. Well, no, it's not, because he even concedes it's not necessarily definitive what he says. But we'll wait until we get there, so I don't want to spoil the fun. So in cases where the class defined by a class concept has only a finite number of terms, it is possible to omit the class concept wholly and indicate the various objects denoted by enumerating the terms and connecting them by means of and or, as the case may be. Okay, so let me just clear a little bit of space. So the words and or are going to be of fundamental importance. Unfortunately, those two words are going to be used in 5 different ways. We're going to have to distinguish 5 different types of combination of terms using only those 2 words. So what I'm going to suggest is, going forward, you cannot necessarily just take the formal kind of written expression of something as completely determinate as to what it is denoting. There's more that you've got to take into consideration, because he will use exactly the same strings of words, let's say, or formal expressions to denote different combinations of terms, and it can be very confusing in many senses. What he's saying here is that if we've got a class concept has only a finite number of terms, so effectively a class concept corresponds to a class. If that class only has a finite number of terms, then we can just effectively define the class by enumeration of its terms. So if we've got the terms A1, A2, A3 up to AN, we can denote the this class by A1 and A2 and A3 and AN. So this word and is playing a very specific role here. It's representing a very specific type of combination of terms, which more will be said about later. But what he's saying is that if we've got a finite number of terms, we can just do away with the class concept and just say this term and this term and this term and this term and so on are the terms of our class. It will help to isolate a part of our problem if we first consider this case, although the lack of subtlety in language renders it difficult to grasp the difference between objects indicated by the same form of words, right? So that's what I was saying earlier, right? Sometimes language is just not it's not articulate enough to make the fine distinctions that need to be made at certain points in kind of philosophical thought. So he says, let us begin by. So you're going to have to really try to see things from Russell's perspective here, and the examples that he gives here, they do, if you look at them long enough, you can convince yourself that they do make sense. But at first glance, they can appear to be quite unhelpful. Not least of all because he uses some quite strange examples. But let's have a look. So let us begin by considering 2 terms only, say Brown and Jones. The objects denoted by all, every, any, a, and some are respectively involved in the following 5 propositions. So before I do that, there's a note here, which says, I intend to distinguish between a and some in a way not warranted by language. The distinction of all and every is also a straining of usage. Both are necessary to avoid circumlocution. So in other words, the way that we typically on an informal level understand these words, we've got to kind of put that to one side a little bit, and we need to understand that Russell is using these words in a very specific sense, which may not exactly coincide with the sense that we typically use these words in everyday speech, right? So you do have to put certain prejudices to one side about what you think you understand by such and such, because it might not coincide with what Russell wants you to understand. Okay, so example number 1. Brown and Jones are 2 of Miss Smith's suitors. So that corresponds to all. So we're taking these words in order. All, every, any, are, and some. So example 1, Brown and Jones are 2 of Miss Smith's suitors. Example 2, Brown and Jones are paying court to Miss Smith. Example 3, if it was Brown or Jones you met, it was a very ardent lover. Example 4, if it was one of Miss Smith's suitors, it must have been Brown or Jones. And example 5, Miss Smith will marry Brown or Jones. Although only 2 forms of words, Brown and Jones and Brown or Jones, are involved in these propositions, I maintain that 5 different combinations are involved. The distinctions, some of which are rather subtle, is an understatement, may be brought out by the following considerations. So in the first proposition, it is Brown and Jones who are 2, and this is not true of either separately. Nevertheless, it is not the whole composed of Brown and Jones, which is 2, for this is only 1. The 2 are a genuine combination of Brown with Jones, the kind of combination which, as we shall see in the next chapter, is characteristic of classes. Okay, so when we say Brown and Jones are 2, this is we are talking about the combination of Brown and Jones as a plurality. But the proposition Brown and Jones are 2, the predicate 2 cannot be applied to Brown or Jones separately. We have to apply that predicate to Brown and Jones as this combination of this plurality. But we're also not referring to Brown and Jones as a single class of objects, right? So again, this is the distinction between a class as one object and a class as many objects, because a class is composed of terms. So on the one hand, it can be considered as a plurality, many. On the other hand, it has a certain unity to it. Okay, and it can be considered as one. And there's a very particular view that Russell has of classes, and the way that I understand it is, I've written a note here actually. So a class is a kind of limit between many and one. Okay, a class is, the terms of a class are held together, according to Russell, in such a way that they are right on the limit of being one and many, right? They're neither one, they're neither many. It's right on the boundary between the two. A very unusual concept, but this is his view. Okay, when we come on to the chapter of class involving classes, I'll say a bit more about this. Okay, so in the second proposition, on the contrary, what is asserted is true of Brown and Jones severally. The proposition is equivalent to, though not, I think, identical with, Brown is paying court to Miss Smith and Jones is paying court to Miss Smith. Thus, the combination indicated by and is not the same here as in the first case. All right, so we've got Brown and Jones. Notice the similarity in the wording. In the first example, we have Brown and Jones. In the second case, we've got Brown and Jones. But the and is playing a different role. It's holding Brown and Jones together. It's combining them in a different way, in a subtly different way. So what's going on here is we can make an assertion about Brown and Jones. Brown and Jones are paying court to Miss Smith, and we can make that assertion about each of Brown or Jones separately, and it is still true. Unlike what we had in the previous case, where we had Brown and Jones are two of Miss Smith's suitors. Well, it's not that Brown is two of Miss Smith's suitors and Jones is two of Miss Smith's suitors. It doesn't make any sense. It's Brown and Jones as a combination of two. But here, Brown and Jones are paying court to Miss Smith. Brown is paying court to Miss Smith, and Jones is paying court to Miss Smith. Okay? So, thus the combination indicated by and is not the same here as in the first case. The first case concerned all of them collectively, while the second concerns all distributively, i.e. each or every one of them. For the sake of distinction, we may call the first a numerical conjunction, since it gives rise to number, and the second a propositional conjunction, since the proposition in which it occurs is equivalent to, but not identical with, a conjunction of propositions. Okay? So, what he means by that is that Brown and Jones are paying court to Miss Smith is equivalent to the proposition Brown is paying court to Miss Smith and Jones is paying court to Miss Smith. So we've got two different propositions there. Brown is paying court to Miss Smith, Jones is paying court to Miss Smith, and we're forming the propositional conjunction. And this is equivalent to Brown and Jones are paying court to Miss Smith. It's not identical with, but it's equivalent to, and hence we refer to this as a propositional conjunction. It should be observed that the conjunction of propositions in question is of a wholly different kind from any of the combinations we are considering. In other words, the combinations of terms that we're considering is not it's not propositional conjunctions do not form part of they're not one of the combinations that we're specifically considering. I don't know if that makes any sense. Being in fact of the kind which is called the logical products. The propositions are combined qua propositions, not qua terms. So Brown and Jones are paying court to Miss Smith. There is a conjunction there of terms. Brown and Jones. Okay? Conjunction of terms. Whereas Brown is paying court to Miss Smith and Jones is paying court to Miss Smith. This is a conjunction of propositions. So there's a very close, again, a close alignment between the two, but there's a subtle distinction that has to be made. The third proposition, this is a pain, is this one. The third proposition gives the kind of conjunction by which any is defined. There is some difficulty about this notion, which seems halfway between a conjunction and a disjunction. This notion may be further explained as follows. Let A and B be two different propositions, each of which implies a third proposition C. Right, so we've got A and B, each of which imply a third proposition C. So A implies C, B implies C. Thus, the disjunction A or B implies C. Now let A and B be propositions assigning the same predicate to two different subjects. Okay, so A and B are subject-predicate propositions. They've got the same predicate but different subjects. So we will understand that the two propositions will have genuinely different subjects. Where was I? Then there is a combination of the two subjects to which the given predicate may be assigned so that the resulting proposition is equivalent to the disjunction A or B. Okay, so we've got a I don't even really know how to explain this, to be honest with you. So, okay, let's go on. Thus, suppose we have, if you met Brown, you met a very ardent lover. and if you met Jones, you met a very ardent lover. Hence we infer if you met Brown or if you met Jones, you met a very ardent lover. And we regard this as equivalent to if you met Brown or Jones, etc. The combination of Brown and Jones here indicated is the same as that indicated by either of them. It differs from a disjunction by the fact that it implies and is implied by a statement concerning both. But in some more complicated instances, this mutual implication fails. The method of combination is, in fact, different from that indicated by both, and is also different from both forms of disjunction. I shall call it the variable conjunction. Okay, there are some comments. Section 75. There is a comment about how we might understand this a little bit better. Where's section 75? So, any number is neither 1 nor 2 nor any other particular number, whence it is easy to conclude that any number is not any one number, a proposition at first sight contradictory, but really resulting from an ambiguity in any, and more correctly expressed by any number is not some one number. And there's also a comment in section 87, I think it is. Just let me check. Section 87. Say that n is 1 or okay, so I won't talk about that because it's yeah, I'm not gonna. There is a comment in section 87 if you want to have a read through section 87 yourself, but it will take me too far afield now. This is just a difficult thing to grasp, in my opinion. But if we take any proposition any assertion that we could make about any, so if I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. So if we've got any A, any proposition, any assertion that could be made about any A will be true about any particular A that is that we're concerned with. So if we've got, I'm jumping ahead to section 61 here, which I'm going to go through in more detail when we come to it. But let's say we've got a finite number of terms. So we've got a finite number of terms, A1, A2, A3 to AN. Then any A denotes A1 or A2 or A3 or AN. Now it doesn't, any A does not denote any particular term. So if we fixate on one of these terms, A1 or A2 or A3, we can be sure that any A does not denote that particular term, because it denotes the combination of all of these terms A1 to AN. This very specific combination, in such a way that any assertion that we can make about any A will be true of any individual term in that particular combination. Okay, this is the way that I've come to understand it. So any assertion that I make about any A will be true about A1. It will also be true about A2. It will also be true about A3. It will also be true about AN individually, right? So using this as an example, if I can, if it was Brown or Jones you met, it was a very ardent lover. Okay, so in other words, Brown is a very ardent lover and Jones is a very ardent lover. Okay, but when we talk about any Brown or Jones, any of Brown or Jones, we're not talking about particular. We're not denoting specifically Brown or specifically Jones. We're talking about a certain combination of both of them, such that what is being asserted is true about each one of them also individually. Spend some time thinking about it. That's all I can suggest. Right, so number 4 then. The first form of disjunction, so that's called the variable conjunction, by the way. So the first form of disjunction is given by for. This is the form which I shall denote by a suitor. Here, although it must have been Brown or Jones, it is not true that it must have been Brown, nor yet that it must have been Jones. Thus, the proposition is not equivalent to the disjunction of propositions. It must have been Brown or it must have been Jones. The proposition, in fact, is not capable of statement either as a disjunction or as a conjunction of propositions, except in the very roundabout form. If it was not Brown, it was Jones, and if it was not Jones, it was Brown, a form which rapidly becomes intolerable when the number of terms is increased beyond 2, and becomes theoretically inadmissible when the number of terms is infinite. Thus, this form of disjunction denotes a variable term, that is, whichever of the two terms we fix upon, it does not denote this term, and yet it does denote one or other of them. This form, accordingly, I shall call the variable disjunction. So this one actually, for me, is a little bit easier to understand. So here we've got an A. So it's the same kind of written representation that we use A1 or A2. So remember what I was saying, you can't just necessarily take the written form as indicative of what is meant. There's a little bit more to it than that. This word or is being used in a very different way to the previous case. So what can be asserted of an A is not necessarily true of any individual term. In fact, it might not be true. What is asserted of an A may not be true of any of the terms individually. Okay, compare that with the previous case where we had whatever can be asserted of any A is also true of each individual A1, A2, A3. So we're dealing with a finite number of terms here. So in other words, we've got, if it was one of Miss Smith's suitors, it must have been Brown or Jones. Okay, he actually uses the case if it was... so if it was one of Miss Smith's suitors, it must have been Brown or Jones. But it's not necessarily Brown, and it's not necessarily Jones. So if we say, if it was one of Miss Smith's suitors that you met, it must have been Brown or Jones. So it had to be one or the other. But it's not forced to have been Brown, and it's not forced to have been Jones. Okay, there is the possibility that it could be Brown or Jones, but it's undecided in a sense. Okay, so that's the main distinction between this and the previous case. That in this case we can assert something of an A, but the assertion doesn't necessarily. In fact, it sometimes might, but it might apply to some of the A's individually, but it might not apply to any of them individually. And then finally, that's called the variable disjunction. And then finally, the second form of disjunction is given by 5. This is what I shall call the constant disjunction, since here either Brown is denoted or Jones is denoted, but the alternative is undecided. That is to say, our proposition is now equivalent to a disjunction of propositions, namely, Miss Smith will marry Brown, or she will marry Jones. She will marry some one of the two, and the disjunction denotes a particular one of them, though it may denote either particular one. Thus, all the 5 combinations are distinct. Okay, so it does seem to be insisting, when it comes to some, that it is one of the terms to which so when we make an assertion about some A, that it is one of the terms to which the assertion can be applied and still be true. Okay. So I don't know if he does if he is allowing for the possibility that there might be more than one here. It seems to be that he's really insisting on there is just one. term. But it's a little bit unclear to me exactly what he means by this. So again, the sum A, it's still denoting a particular combination. It's not denoting a single term. It is still denoting a combination of terms. Okay. So the way that he, in fact, I'll leave that actually until the next video. I'm going to wrap this video shortly, so I'll say more on these in the next video, because they are quite, again, they are quite subtle, these distinctions, and it might be worth trying to just spending a little bit more time trying to explain what I think is going on. Okay, so it is to be observed that, oh, do I need to go on to the next page? Uh, 59. Oh, I should have changed the page a long time ago. I completely forgot about it. Right, okay. It is to be observed that these 5 combinations yield neither terms nor concepts, but strictly and only combinations of terms. So again, sum A, it's representing a combination. So when we've got this, Miss Smith will marry Brown or Jones, it is a combination that is being denoted there. A combination of Brown or Jones, a very specific combination, not Brown or, and it's neither Brown that's being denoted nor Jones that's being denoted, but some specific combination. The first yields many terms, while the others yield something absolutely peculiar, which is neither one nor many. The combinations are combinations of terms, effected without the use of relations. Okay, corresponding to each combination, there is, at least if the terms combined form a class, a perfectly definite concept which denotes the various terms of the combination combined in the specific manner. To explain this, let us repeat our distinctions in a case where the terms to be combined are not enumerated as above, but are defined as the terms of a certain class. So that will be for the next video. So I'm going to wrap it up there. So we're up to section 60. I think this video is going for long enough already. So any questions, feel free to ask. If you would be so kind as to consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and putting a nice positive comment in the comments section. I'm looking to do a lot more uploads to this channel over the coming weeks and coming months. So I've got a lot that I want to get through. So I'm quite I'm going to stick with this form of making videos where I just sit down and I just basically talk to the camera, and it's in that way I can get through more stuff. It does mean that my videos are less planned out. They're not quite as polished as maybe they have been in the past, but I can seem to get through a lot more stuff. And what I'm really interested in doing is just getting my ideas out there so that people can actually start making use of them. It does mean, unfortunately, that to find out what I've got to say, you've really just got to watch my videos. Sometimes I don't even know what I'm going to say when I start a video. I don't know exactly what I'm going to say. So, okay, thank you for watching. If you made it this far into the video, and I'm going to finish there, and I'll say I will look forward to seeing you in the next video.